We are lucky enough to have Mr. John Edwards as a working member of our own Villanova campus ministry team. Mr. Edwards dedicates his time specifically in the spirituality and discernment subcategory of campus ministry life. He is a St. Rita of Cassica Fellow and focuses much of his time on campus ministry retreats and how these experiences for students integrate both prayer, spirituality, and interior life into one. He is with us today to share his wisdom on the interconnectedness of prayer and social justice and how that connection is essential in becoming a true servant leader.
Julie, a little technical LT.
Is this important if you work with the camera, or is it not really?
Yeah, it's gonna be connected to the camera, so it's gonna be just on the camera. So if you want to wear it, it'd be good.
Is that all right? Sure. Can't really take me off my camera.
Is it all? Is that what it needs to be?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Now I feel way too official. Well, hi everyone. I'm John, and I guess talking about prayer is a difficult thing because it is something that none of us are ever very good at, I think. And I think recognizing that we're not good at it is part of the reality that is transformative and also what connects us with everyone else. Our struggle in being able to be present is precisely the first step of recognizing, wow, there is this connectedness between all of us because we all have this difficulty. This is all something that we struggle with, being present to one another. And there's kind of an immediate communion that happens in that recognition. So I think, but it's hard to talk about, partly because using language to talk about something that is interior, and language is what falls short when you start having an experience of what is within, you know. And so our language is always trying to grasp something that is not graspable. So using words and trying to talk about prayer is kind of an odd experience and an odd thing, but it can still be worthwhile if you have, I think, a reflective space where as you're listening to each other, to us, this conversation, that you're also listening to yourself interiorly. You know, do any of these things map onto your own experience? Can you read your own sense of whatever your interiority is at this point into what's being said? And is there a correspondence at all between the two? And if you can have that kind of mentality, then talking about it can be helpful, as long as it's not this disconnected discourse that happens over here that's not happening related to what's happening in here. That's where then language is totally pointless. So I guess I want to have a conversation with everyone, explore this question of prayer with you, regardless of what your religious background is, or whether you have one or don't, regardless of what your practice of prayer currently is or isn't. That's okay. I think I want to have a conversation where we can explore what does prayer have to do with the idea of service or servant leadership or work for justice, any of these phrases that you've all been engaged with the whole semester. And I hope that the differences in our practices or in our traditions is a source of richness, right? That we dialogue out of that difference in tradition. And as long as you're willing to speak for yourself and speak only for yourself, and that you're not threatened by what anyone else says about prayer or interior life, then there's the recognition that this is dialogue breeds richness and deepening rather than division or separation or but it's partly being attentive to when you feel threatened. Why does what this person says threaten me? Do I feel threatened? What the threatening is probably happening inside of you, not in what they're saying. And why do we have this reaction of feeling threatened at all? Why do we see the other as somehow belittling or diminishing or attacking who you are? Why does that happen? That's happening inside of us more than it's happening outside of us. So I want to start, I guess, by getting all of you involved in this conversation, because I think me talking is only partially useful, if anything. So I want to ask the question of just why do we pray? Or if you don't pray, why would someone pray? Whether they're Christian or Buddhist or Muslim or, and depending on your tradition, you might have a different answer to the question of why, but why would you pray or why would someone pray? I think it's helpful to just, not the right answer, not what you think is the right answer, but just what is your best understanding of why prayer? Why is it worth doing?
Emotions are complicated.
What did you say?
Emotions are complicated, so like to sit through your emotions and kind of recognize where you're at.
Okay. Sifting through emotions. Maybe you're kind of saying finding yourself, finding where you are. Okay. What else?
And praying for someone else.
Okay. And why would you pray for them?
Whether they're in like a time of crisis or like in the hospital, pray for them to get better.
And why pray though? Like why is prayer a reaction that you would have? I mean, this is kind of maybe really basic, but it was something that we all have the instinct, oh, I'll pray. But why do we have the instinct of pray, do you think? I mean, it doesn't have to be you, I'm sorry, I don't want to put you on the spot, but why pray? Why would pray be a reaction that we'd have? You ever thought?
I mean, I guess for me to feel more secure, that like, I guess I would pray to God, so hopefully some type of miracle, like pray for a miracle to happen, for them to get better, or something.
So someone else's needs trigger insecurity in you or in us. That some part of that leads us to prayer.
I guess, yeah.
Okay, Caitlin?
I was going to say, praying for someone else is like an affirmation that that person is important to you. Like if you take time out your day to think about them, then it's just sort of keeping them in mind and reminding yourself that having that person around is important.
Okay.
I think it's also like an appeal to a higher power. So if you feel powerless in a situation, like if someone's like very sick, and like you feel that there's like someone out there that like has more power than you, who can maybe intervene and help, or who can listen to like your problem and maybe really not supposed to listen.
Okay. So I mean, I think that's really important. Like, there's some ways it's like it's the last resort thing to do. We treat it that way, right? It's like, I have nothing else to do to help you. I want to make you better. I want to be able to make something concrete difference in your situation, but I have nothing that I can do, right? Or we feel that way at least. And so we do the only thing that we can do at that point, and that is trust, hope that someone other than ourselves can make a difference, can do a difference, right? So it's kind of, we feel powerless to do anything else sometimes. And then the point about security, to face our own insecurity maybe. Anything else?
I think prayer can also be a really joyful thing, and it's just a really an opportunity to give thanks and sit with God and realize how blessed we are and recognize the beauty around us.
Okay, so it's kind of another place, like there's almost a loss of words to be able to express gratitude. Is that right? Like, okay. I'll just put. Okay. Anything else?
I think just in general, just to like establish a relationship with any divine presence that we either think or know or believe is there.
Okay. So I'll put to connect to or to relate to. Divine presence. Any other thoughts?
For guidance.
Okay. For guidance, like your decision making, or right, kind of thing. Yeah. Or we might use the word discernment, and that. Anyone else? What's that?
Confession.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
That you feel like you wronged God and come to Him for forgiveness.
So asking for forgiveness, admitting some kind of guilt and asking for forgiveness. Anyone else? This might not say up here. Anyone else? Other thoughts? Okay. Is that good?
I know like sometimes people pray for some things. For example, like, please God, help me get a hand attached or something like that.
Okay, so asking for things that we need, right?
Yeah.
And it could be petty things, it could be big things. We might call that petitionary prayer. Sometimes people use formal language. Okay. Best.
Sometimes I try to work through things, like work through struggles, because like I know some situations where you always feel like you want to talk to like maybe another student. So like,
Okay.
I don't know, just trying to deal with things.
So maybe seeking support in working out a difficult situation or needing support. Yeah. Mark, what were you going to say?
Sort of along the same lines, how like I guess like we're like reflecting on your daily actions and then trying to find out a way to improve upon them and sort of I guess like try to avoid I guess the mistakes that you made or try to work on being like a better person.
Okay. Anyone else? I think this is a pretty good list. Last minute, or last minute additions? Tyler, you're going to speak. You look like you're on the verge of saying something, but maybe you're not.
I was taking a reflective breath.
Okay, that's let's put this in there. Okay, and then I want to ask like a corollary question, and that is, why don't we pray, or why might someone not pray? So, does that make sense, that question? Why would someone have a rejection of prayer or hesitancy or reluctance to pray? Whether that's you or whether, it can be your answer or just kind of generic answers that we maybe are just out there culturally that you are familiar with.
I like a lot of things we said for why we pray that support wanting things, or maybe reason not to pray where I can do it. Yeah, I'll need someone to do something.
Okay. we think we're self-sufficient or something like that?
Well, I was going to say it's prayer in a way people can see it as something that's not necessarily directly concrete or tangible. Since I guess it kind of sounds like what they were saying, addressing their needs or furthering on their spiritual life. It's not something concrete or tangible.
It's not tangible. Yeah. Okay. So because it's not tangible, we maybe question what use it has, right? Okay. So is it real or useful? Okay, good. Yeah.
Like sometimes like a loss in faith, whether like sometimes like you hit rock bottom. Oh, were you gonna say that?
Nope. I was done before. Just because I was.
You're what? Okay. No.
You guys are on the same wavelength.
I lost my thought.
A loss in faith, hit rock bottom.
Oh, and you just can't train me.
Okay,
It's just
so
really hard to have faith in that fire.
So there's doubt.
Yeah.
Some kind of doubt.
But there was like a faith at one point.
So okay, loss of faith. Okay.
I think kind of like along with that, just the stigma that prayer has to be something like faith related or God related or like religion based. If someone maybe has some other issue with that religion, they would feel like anti-prayer because like, oh, praying is along the lines of religion and that's not me. I think just like, if that is what you believe prayer to be, then that person might feel hesitant to pray.
So prayer, we say prayer is confined to a specific formula, specific way.
If that, like if you take it as
People see it as being confined to a particular formula.
Yeah.
Particular. Okay. Okay. Mark?
I guess this is sort of going back to what Jenna said earlier. Like, it does take work, like working on your interior life, and sometimes it's just easier to ignore it. I guess it might.
Okay. Takes work and discipline, maybe? Okay. We'll add it. It's kind of up here, but no, but I think that's a good word, I think, to add. Why do you use the word pointless?
A lot of people would either say, that they're praying to nothing and it's a waste of time, or that this argument that if it's God's will, it's going to happen anyway, so there's no point to really pray for it.
Okay, so no one hearing me, or that person isn't going to respond to what I have to say anyway.
Yes.
Okay. So no one to hear me, or they don't care what I want, maybe? I'm going to pull this off here. Anyone else?
I think it can also be kind of an apathy, just don't think about it kind of thing, like, oh, things are going well in my life, I don't know, it's, like we were talking about, we pray when there's a crisis, we feel powerless, and we don't know what to do, but if it's not even a direct decision, oh, I'm not going to pray, it's just oh, I just don't think about praying kind of thing. If you don't make, I guess that's the work part of it, if you don't make a direct effort to do it, then you just don't, until something like that happens.
Okay. Nothing pressing to pray about, maybe is a way of putting it. Okay, cool. Yeah.
I think sometimes people feel like there's like strict guidelines on like a certain way, like exactly to pray, and so that can be like daunting if someone like feels like they don't know how if they think that there's those guidelines, they don't feel like they know how to pray or pray like everyone else supposedly does. So that can be, I think, like uncomfortable.
Okay, good. Anyone else?
Kind of like what Mark was saying, and then back to Jenna about it being like challenging to look into your life and whatnot. It can be scary because like a lot of the different things that we said, why to pray, like to focus on your emotions and what you're going through, and that can be a scary thing.
That's good. I mean, I think fear is a big part of what prayer is about. What is the fear about, do you think? Or what can the fear be about?
There are things that maybe are you're uncomfortable dealing with that maybe have happened, or maybe like along the lines of asking for forgiveness, like things that you might have done that you don't feel comfortable with, that you just kind of like want to leave behind and not deal with because it's easier not to.
Okay.
I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, no, it is. Why are we afraid of what's uncomfortable? I mean, in some ways it's a basic reaction. It just kind of like seems obvious. Oh, it's comfortable, we're afraid. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, can we think about why? Why do we have that reaction?
You don't want to see yourself as a bad person, maybe? Or you don't want other people to see you as a bad person?
Okay.
Kind of what you said at the beginning, maybe just being vulnerable to being threatened by other people.
Yeah, okay. That's good. There is, right, some fear about if I acknowledge comfortability, will I find that I'm not very solid? Right? Will I find that I'm not actually real? Will I actually still exist if I engage this? Will I be overcome by whatever it is that the fear is about, right? Will I be able to withstand whatever engage in this, right? So I think there's a fear about whether or not we're substantive enough, whether or not we're going to still be standing on the other side of whatever it is that has to be engaged, right? Will I be dissolved by this storm, whatever the storm is, right? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
I think there can be like an intellectual piece that goes in like a resistance to pray, and I think there can also be like a feeling of like push or judgment. Like if you are standing outside of the community of prayer and feel like pressure to join or pressure to conform or judged for not being part of that, like why would you want to participate in something that you feel?
So like, are you doing this freely? Like, am I doing this freely, or am I doing this out of conformity or out of pressure from outside? Is that
right? Or even like if there's a perception of like judgment along with it, and then therefore like a harsh evaluation of me from this community. Why would I want to participate in this community? That's not like if it's hostile towards me, why would I participate?
A reaction to being excluded or something like that.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the anti-intellectual?
I think that a lot of times, like faith and reason are juxtaposed to each other, and so if prayer is like kind of associated with either like the faith camp or the feelings camp, those are things that are often like seen like not as hearty.
So prayer is anti-intellectual, not
yes.
that. Okay,
yes.
Got it. So it doesn't fit into a reasonable account of the world. It doesn't fit into. That's not okay. Yeah. Anyone else?
Also, there can be like a frustration that comes when like there's a lot of like bad things that happen and like you feel like prayers aren't getting answered, or like you see a lot of suffering and you see a lot of like bad and evil, and you're just wondering like what kind of conversation with something that's supposed to be so good, like what can that do?
So like can't see fruit or something, can't see visible fruit. Okay. Any last comments? I think these are both pretty good lists, but anyone else? Okay. So I want to leave these up here, both reasons maybe to pray or reasons not to pray, because I think it's helpful to have them visible in front of us. And I want you to keep them in your mind as we're going and talking and as we're interacting about these questions. Keep in our minds, which of these things do you need to keep? Both reasons for prayer, reasons not to pray. Which of these things stick with you as legitimate reasons worth keeping, right? Which of them maybe need to be recontextualized or understood a bit differently for them to have a place or to be effective in your own search for spirituality or prayer? And then which things need to be discarded? Like are things that need to be, this isn't effective for me anymore. This was a reason for me as a child, right? And now this doesn't work for me, or whatever. But which things maybe are no longer helpful and maybe can be let go of. So just I think as we're thinking about them, keeping them visible, so that inside yourself, you can kind of reevaluate. We can come back to that maybe at the end. Okay, so I wanted to talk about two things really. One is just first giving us some ways that I think are pretty both helpful to me and I think fairly ancient in ways of understanding what prayer is, right? The practice of prayer. Maybe it's different from the way that we have for most of our lives understood prayer, what we've understood it to be. So prayer or interiority. What are these things? How can we understand them? And then secondly, the question for all of you today is, what value does prayer have for a life of service, right? Is prayer helpful when we're facing questions of grave injustice or oppression? What good does it do? Why should I do it? And I think it's not so much about me telling you why you should or shouldn't do it as being open to discovering, is this a tool that could be helpful for my own understanding of service or of justice work or whatever it is however you want to frame that kind of work. Does that make sense? Okay. So and please interact with me. I don't want to be a monologue up here. So if there are things that don't make sense or things that you have comments on, stop me as we go. So I want to maybe I'll put one piece of paper. Okay, so I think for me, the most simple and helpful way of understanding prayer, again, these are words that kind of try to get out of reality, right? But I see it as any practice of trying to be present to what is, right? Any practice of trying to be present to what's actually happening right now. We could talk about a practice of befriending reality, befriending what's actually going on, whatever that is, not needing to make it something different, not trying to make it into what we want it to be, but actually relating to what's really happening rather than relating to our disappointment about what's not happening or our fear about what should be happening, but actually letting go of the things that get in the way of relating and seeing to what's actually happening, right? Whether that's happening to us or happening to someone else, right? But the practices of becoming more able to see and be present to what's actually going on instead of what we want to be going on. Okay. Trying to get in the back of my head. So, Will already mentioned Augustine and the Augustine tradition, but one of Augustine's lines is, God, you were within me, but I was outside myself. Right? This recognition that God was inside of him, but he wasn't there. So the reality was not that God is absent, but that Augustine, or that we're absent. Right? We're the one, God is waiting for us, and we're not there. Or I like to think about this, we can talk about in terms of space, right? Prayer is that God is in the present, right? That God happens in the present, and that if we're not in the present, we're cut off from God. Or if we don't, to not use the God language, the possibility of experiencing love is in the present, right? The possibility of knowing love, receiving love is right now. It's only right now, and it's not tomorrow, it's not yesterday, but most of the time we're not right now. We're somewhere tomorrow, or we're yesterday, or we're 5 years ago, or we're thinking about next year. We're not right now. And that being cut off from right now is what most of prayer is coming to recognize that how much we aren't in the present. And I think a lot of the practice of prayer, and I think what Lauren mentioned, others have mentioned about, is there a formula for praying? Is there a right way? Do I need to go into church and kneel down and say an Our Father or Hail Mary or say certain words? Actually don't help us to be any more present as part of the problem, right? But that prayer is whatever helps us to be here in the present. I remember one time, I've often gone on silent retreats where you just basically go for several days and it's mostly just silence. Which the first time that I went, it's a very scary idea to go and think that you're going to just have silence for however many days. And I remember one time going on retreat and putting my I had a little suitcase and put my suitcase down next to the bed, and all of a sudden I was completely panicked. Like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do for 5 days? I didn't bring any kind of thing to do. I didn't bring anything to do. I had 5 days in this place, nothing to do, and there was this real sense of panic, of like, who am I going to be? What am I going to do for 5 whole days? And there was a real legitimate sense of like, right, what do I do? And that was even after I've been on retreat a few different times and had a sense of knowing that this kind of thing is effective and helpful for me and I really get a lot out of it. But there was still the immediate reaction of all the things that I had been doing and all the ways that my life was defined before being there, and all of a sudden they weren't there anymore. And will I still be someone when I don't have anything to do, right? Will I still have a self when I don't have the things and the people that define me there? And so I remember, though, that first day of being there, and for me, one practice that's really effective is the practice of just walking very slowly. And I went out for a walk, and the practice of just walking and watching one foot in front of the other for maybe 10 or 20 minutes, very slowly. All of a sudden, it was like my eyes on my feet, one after the other, and all of a sudden something clicked, and I was present. Like I hadn't been, and all of a sudden, all that I was thinking about was what was right there in front of me. But it was a very drastic shift from the sense of fear about what am I going to accomplish, what am I going to do, who am I going to be, to all of a sudden, there was just presence. There was no fear. It was just, I'm here right now. So I think finding practices, for me, the practice of walking is really helpful, but finding practices that bring you to whatever is present is really important. It's really key. And they might not be the same for all of us. Sometimes nature is a really effective thing for people. Sometimes the church is important. Sometimes it's not. But what are the practices that make you feel like all that's in front of you is what's happening right now? I think it's important to maybe identify some of those. So do people have any thoughts about that? Can you recognize things for yourself, practices that make you present? Things that you know habitually have been there in the past that you just recognize, when I do this, I tend to be more only right where I am.
Something that was really effective for me, like high school I ran track and cross country, and going on like just a really long run. It's just afterwards you kind of like, you don't even realize that when you're running, but like afterwards when you stop, you're like, oh, I have to go like do this thing now. But there's points like within the run where you just kind of like lose yourself in running. You don't even like realize you're running anymore. You're just like going. And I don't know, that was always really, really nice. And I don't know if anyone runs, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, you just kind of like lose yourself, you know?
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I don't really run, but I understand that.
Especially when you're like out in nature, like there's like no people around you, like by yourself. Like I would never run with like other people, but do that by myself. And it's nice to just lose yourself.
Why do you think that people not being around is helpful?
Because it's like more of a distraction. Because when you're not, like when you start to run, you're always like talking to yourself. And there comes a point where you're just like, you're not even talking to yourself anymore, you're just kind of like being. And there's nothing going on that, like, you don't have to worry about continuing conversation with somebody else. It's totally just like you and just intertwined in the act that you're doing. There's no distraction. And you're forced to be like right there. Because you're out in the wilderness and you know, not getting by person.
Look, I mean, I think the presence of others sometimes it causes you to think about who am I to them, or how am I relating to them? How are they seeing me? How are they not seeing me? What do they want from me? What do they not want from me? Am I meeting their needs? Am I not meeting their needs? And all those things and then we start to think that, well, I am what I am doing or not doing for this person. Who I am is defined by what this person needs or wants from me, or what I'm able to give them, not give them. And I think that we have this we narrow ourselves into that, oh, I am this, whatever I am for this person right now, right? And the more that our whole days are spent with various different people, it's, you know, we can feel like, well, I am the person who plays a series of roles for different people, right? We get reduced to that sense of who we are to others, right? And which those things might be very much a part of who we are, but the problem comes when we think that that's the depth, that's the totality of who we are, right? So I think that the point about whether others are present or not is important. Other people have practices that you know are effective for you?
I like to draw. When I'm drawing, I don't think about anything, not in particular, and I don't worry, and sometimes it ends up being bad for you because I'll delete something because of like present moment of drawing, but yeah, it helps me just like move the stage.
Anyone else?
Taking on Holland is like one of my favorite guys ever. And he has these set up 10 mindful movements that he moves on mindfulness, doing these meditative kind of like yoga-ish kind of stretches. Just like my experience with those, it really helped me to like be present with what's going on right now, present with the feelings within myself. And of course, it keeps away from the distractions of other people as well, especially when you're doing like out in the field with everyone can watch you, you don't care what people are thinking and stuff.
I really love the rosary. Not as like a cop out, like I can't think of anything else to say, and like these are prescribed words, but just because like it gets me to sit in like a set amount of time really, because there's no way to rush it, which is a tendency that I have. That like just the familiarity of like the words and the mysteries and the cycle, and just kind of the setting of it always just like leads me back into a place that I know I'm comfortable and where I can encounter God and all of the richness of my tradition, and knowing that like no matter what I'm going through, like those words will take on just like a different meaning that
Anyone else? And I think all three of these, like all these examples are things that kind of get our minds to stop, right? They get our minds to stop telling us who we are, why we aren't, who we should be, who we shouldn't be, and there are things that are rote. I mean, in some ways, I think we can have, our culture can have a rejection of like rote prayers or things that are already written because you're just saying the things that someone else tells you to say, and what if these words don't mean anything to me? What if they're just words that I'm saying? Well, that's part of the value in some way, that the roteness sometimes is exactly what stops us from, gives us space between what our heads are saying and then what's deeper than or more, beyond what our heads are saying, right? That turning off of the constant voices in our heads, so that we experience that we are more than those voices, right? So I think that the roteness that whether it's running or drawing or the rote prayer, that all has the same quality of doing something that gets our minds to stop thinking. Okay, so if prayer is a practice of being in the present or either temporally or spatially, and if we're talking about we pray because we're actually not in the present, the question I think for me that comes up is, well, where are we most of the time? Right? If prayer is about being in the present and the problem is that we're not there, but God is there, or the capacity to experience love is in the present, where are we most of the time if we're not in the present?
And especially like right now in college, a lot of us are kind of like thinking future type thing. Like I know, like a lot of my conversations with my friends have been like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" kind of thing. Like, where are we going? Like, what am I going to do this summer? Like an internship or research, or like what am I going to do next year? Or am I going to get a job? Do I want to go to higher education? Like I don't know. So that can like be a source of like a lot of anxiety and a lot of like time and concentration. Like just kind of like focusing on that like future moment and not like living like right now. Like I'm still like a sophomore. I'm just taking it day by day.
Anyone else? Thoughts on where we are? Where are we if we're not present?
I think like even though we're physically present, like mentally, like we might be thinking about things that are like going on, but like you're never fully like emptying your mind of everything. So like even though we're here, it might be like, oh well, I have so much homework and I have to go do this or that afterwards, and like how am I gonna put it all in? But like even though you're fully here, like you're not giving someone the full attention.
Mm-hmm. Good. I know this can feel very theoretical because the language is difficult. But the question of being present to what is, if we're not being present to what's actually going on, what are we doing instead of that?
I spend a lot of time in the present worrying about things that haven't happened in the future yet.
Okay.
So like I project a situation and then I just like live in that anxiety.
Okay.
So that's like I'm very present to something that doesn't exist, but it's like a fear of something that could exist.
Right. Okay. So we spend a lot of time. We're spending avoiding things that we're afraid of. We're trying to protect ourselves. Right? We're afraid of loss. We're afraid of the future. We're afraid of death. We're afraid of failure. We're afraid of rejection. Right? And those fears are getting us to actually relate to reality by trying to avoid any of those things happening. Right? What can I do to make sure that X, Y, and Z doesn't happen? Right? And then we're not actually asking, well, what is happening? We're spending whether we're not conscious of it, but we're spending most of our time trying to prevent things from happening. Does that swing as true to people? So that avoidance of painful things, we're trying to protect ourselves from pain, avoid pain, or we're trying to get the things that we think that we want or need. Right? We have categories of painful things, pleasurable things. I want to avoid these things, I want to get these things, and most of our identities are constructed around trying to avoid or get things rather than asking, well, what's actually there? What's actually here right now? How do I relate to what's here instead of what isn't here or what I wish were here, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So let's see. I guess just one example. I remember the first time that the idea of not needing to avoid anxiety or fear or pain. That's a nice idea, right? It's hard to actually practice, I think. I remember a few years ago, the first time when I recognized, for whatever reason, I was anxious. I mean, we all have anxiety for different reasons. Jenna, I understand that, like living in the future anxiety. But it was the first time I recognized that, you know what, I'm really anxious right now. I could actually choose to stay with myself throughout this anxiety until it goes away if I want to. I could choose to actually sit next to the feeling of anxiety for as long as it takes for it to go away if I wanted to. I could acknowledge I'm really anxious. And rather than just going on with the next 5 things I have to do and trying to get rid of the anxiety or trying to find a way of running it out or doing whatever it takes to kind of get rid of it because I'd rather not feel anxious, I could just simply acknowledge I'm really anxious. I'm not going to leave myself alone until the anxiety goes away, right? But the ability that these feelings that we don't want, that are not wanted, that we try to flee from, we could actually step into them, be next to them, not be moved by them, and see that we're not overcome by them. I remember going through what felt like a really serious breakup after a long relationship, and I went away on a retreat like 3 weeks later, and I had this discovery of what I thought was going to completely tear me apart, but I didn't think I could survive. I didn't think I would be able to live through. Who would I still be now that this defining relationship that was in my life was no longer there? Will I still be myself, right? And then a week of silence and this recognition of, despite all the feelings of overwhelmed and fear and all the things that were happening, that who I wasn't going to be overcome, right? And that's really easy to say, but it's another thing when you're in the midst of a panic, and then all of a sudden you can come to this realization that this really terrifying reality is not going to disappear. I'm not going to end. I'm not going to be dissolved by the fact that I'm going through this terrifying thing. But it's that recognition that we are something more than what we thought we were. So there's more to us. There's more depth there than we thought was there. Okay. So anyone have comments or questions about things you want to interject about what prayer is? Things I haven't said.
Is there a difference between like sitting with feeling versus like feeding feeling? Like if I'm acknowledging that I'm sad, am I then going to like cry myself until I've spent it, or am I just like is that a passive process? Is that an active process? Are you like feeding that emotion, or are you just kind of like watching it?
Yeah, I think the observing, like as long as you're observing, then you're seeing that part of you isn't overcome by it, isn't consumed by it, right? As long as you can say, oh, I see that part of me that is really sad. And if you can keep looking at it, then there's part of you that's not in it, right? And so, and you have to be careful, because part of the temptation is either you can get dissolved by it and just feel really sad and feel really sad and feel really sad, or run away from it and say, I don't want to be sad, let me go do it. Which, those aren't necessarily awful things to do, but there's something about, can I just sit here and watch this part of me that's really sad, look at it, and then recognize that this part of me that's looking at it is something that is deeper, that's different, that's deeper than what the part of me that feels sad. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How do you know when you're in the present moment? What does it feel like? What do you think it feels like?
I think for me, I think it feels like a sense of having let go of things, a sense of bigness, a sense of openness, a sense that I'm grounded in something that who I am is something that's much deeper than what I can put a limit around. But I don't know that it's always the same experience, or that it's always. I think that we can think that we found to be present, only to then 5 weeks later or a year later recognize, oh wow, I'm still really absent. I'm still really distant. And I think the point is that not that we beat ourselves up for recognizing that how not present we are, but that every time we recognize that we're not present is the opportunity to take one step closer, to be slightly more present, right? And that's continually a continual path, right? Which can be part of the reason why we don't do it, because it does this discipline. It's a lifetime worth of becoming more present, not something that happens, oh, I'm present and I know what presence is like. What being fully present is like this. Now I'm done, or I've accomplished this. So I think it's hard to answer that question. So I know that we're kind of running out of time, but I don't want to totally not talk about the question that we all, about interiority and justice and servant leadership. But I think the practice of being present to yourself, the practice of being present to things that we find intolerable or difficult or painful, we can't really be present to another's pain, another's grief, another's chaos, whatever that looks like in their life, if we aren't able to be present to our own chaos. If our own chaos overwhelms us, then so is theirs going to overwhelm us. If we aren't able to acknowledge when we're anxious and sit through it and be okay with being anxious, then someone else's anxiety is going to certainly make us anxious as well. And what good are we? What service do we provide if we aren't able to be okay with our own feelings of being overwhelmed, our own fear that we're going to be dissolved by something? Well, if you haven't sat through that, then how do you help someone else who is overwhelmed, who is lost in whatever the storm is in their life at the present, right? And so I think what we have to give to the other, whoever that other is, comes from what we've discovered in ourselves. So I think that that practice of being present, and we shouldn't, I think, see it as something that's kind of a dichotomy, that what I do for myself then will pay off in what I do for others, right? But that these things, being present to yourself or to the other, that they feed off of each other, right? The other might be the source of helping you to become present all of a sudden. We don't need to go and live in a monastery for a year, learn what it means to be present, and now we can go out and do service, right? But that we be present or present to whatever is happening. If the other is what's happening, can we be present to that other right then? And can we allow the anxiety that they trigger in us to be okay with it's a back and forth, What else? I had a couple of great words of wisdom that I wanted to make sure that I said before the end of this discussion. Well, I guess two things. One is that whatever we find to be enslaving in ourselves or oppressive in ourselves is the same thing that's enslaving or oppressive to the other, right? That what oppresses people is not so much institutions or external realities, but it's fear. We're oppressed by fear, right? And we can distinguish between, let's say, material oppression, whether it's economic or social or cultural or physical or psychological, and the kind of spiritual oppression, which is this being run by fear, right? That our identities are run by what we're afraid of, or what we're not afraid of. And the material oppression can be the means of expressing or making real the spiritual oppression, but the spiritual piece is what's foundational, what's fundamental. So we can do service and we can change the fact that whatever is making this person not have, to be poor, whatever is keeping them oppressed materially, whatever is a source of economic loss or poverty. But if we don't help them to help others, help ourselves to be more present to what's going on, to not be conquered by fear or by anxiety, then we're just kind of shifting a lot of the externals without actually doing any change. And so I think paying attention to the relationship between what is external and the material kinds of oppression and what is internal, what's spiritual, and that these two things feed each other. And if you're just changing structures and you're not helping people to be more fully themselves, then something is missing, something's not connecting. Does that make sense? Let's see, anything else? I guess one last thing is, I think for myself, one of the things that you come to see a little more clearly when you practice some form of trying to be present, whether it's silence or whatever way that we try to engage the present, you start to see the ways in which we try to make someone of ourselves by diminishing someone else. You start to see the ways in which we make ourselves someone through evaluation of others. I'm good because I'm better than you at this. I'm a person because I'm the best at this thing. Or I know that I'm worth something because I can do this really well. Others can't. And we think that who we are is the result or is the sum total of all those things that we can do better than anyone else. And then we have these identities. We have the sense of ourselves that are based on what others we can dismiss, or how we can devalue others becomes first essential to how we understand ourselves, right? It almost becomes essential that for me to be someone, I have to know that I'm better than you at this. Who I am is dependent upon the fact that I know that those people are bad, and therefore I'm good. And if that's who we are, then if that's true, then justice isn't really possible, right? There's no possibility of equality if who we are is dependent upon being better than or excluding someone else. Equality is not possible, right? But to the extent that I can recognize who I am is actually that if I were awful at everything, that my identity would not in the least be threatened. If I were not good, if I had nothing good that I could, a skill that I could say that I had, or that I could be better than someone else at anything, that my identity is not threatened by that. If that's true, then that recognition is what makes it possible for us to be present to the other, right? And so that when this question of justice or service to the oppressed, it becomes recognition that, well, I'm an oppressor, right? And I make a self for myself by oppressing others, maybe in very small, almost unnoticeable ways to anyone else. But the fact is I do that. So that means that anyone else who I see as selfish or unloving, or I can point out their selfishness, I immediately have this bond of solidarity with them, because it's like, oh yeah, I do that all the time. Oh, I don't do it about soccer, but I do it about this. Or I'm not snobby about this, but I am about this. There's this immediate bond of solidarity to the extent that you yourself know that, yeah, actually it's true. I don't know who I am if I'm not the smartest kid in the class. I don't know who I am if I can't say that person is stupid. If I can't make that evaluation, I don't know who I am. Well, if I know that I do that, then all of a sudden I'm forced to be faced with my judgments. Does that make sense? Okay, I feel like I've talked way too much. Are there any questions, comments? I'm not sure what time we're at, but...
We have time for a few questions.
Any thoughts?
It's a little response to Tyler's question, when he was like, be fully present. How do you compare it to into a pool with like really cold water. And then when you first jump in, it was like a shock. You like lose your breath for a second. But after a minute or two, you like get used to the temperature and then you just like swim around and you're fine. So I would definitely, if I had to put words to it, it would be like that. And then you have to get out and then go into it again to get into that. So.
To add on to that, it's almost like for me, I don't really notice it until like I'm not in the present anymore. Like I have to go back and be like, oh wow, like, that was crazy. Because when you're in it, you feel like you've been there forever and like you've never really existed without it. Until I guess it's almost like something snaps you back into reality and then you like just start to define yourself again and you start defining what's the past, what's the present, and what's the future. And then you're like, oh, that's what I was kind of doing. So it's I can't really, for me, I can't recognize it when I'm actually in it. I have to like go back and it's like everything comes back to me, like words and like definitions and everything. And I'm like, oh, okay. Because I just don't have it anymore. So I don't know. That's just me.
Well, thank you.